The gymnasium fell completely silent. 28 teenagers who had been laughing and jeering just seconds before now stood frozen, their mouths hanging open in disbelief. The wooden board that had been hanging innocently from the ceiling moments earlier now lay in two perfect pieces on the polished floor. And standing in the center of it all, adjusting her glasses with trembling hands, was the same woman they had been mocking for her stutter just 30 seconds ago. But let me back up and tell you how we got here, because this story begins 3 weeks earlier in the most unlikely place you'd expect to find a future legend. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Rebecca Martinez had been dreading this moment for months. Standing in the parking lot of Riverside High School in Columbus, Ohio, she gripped the steering wheel of her aging Honda Civic until her knuckles turned white. Through the windshield, she watched streams of teenagers flowing through the main entrance, their voices carrying across the asphalt in waves of laughter and conversation that made her stomach twist into knots. At 26, Rebecca looked younger than most of the seniors she was about to teach. Her petite frame barely reached 5'3", and despite her best efforts with makeup that morning, the dark circles under her brown eyes betrayed the sleepless nights she'd spent preparing for this day. Her shoulder-length black hair was pulled back into what she hoped was a professional-looking bun, though several rebellious strands had already escaped to frame her face. The irony wasn't lost on her that someone who struggled with speech had chosen to become an English teacher. But literature had always been her sanctuary. In books, words flowed perfectly. Characters never stumbled over consonants or felt their tongues betray them at crucial moments. On paper, she was eloquent, thoughtful, and articulate. It was only when those same words had to leave her mouth that everything fell apart. Rebecca's stutter had been her constant companion since childhood. It wasn't severe enough to prevent her from functioning, but it was noticeable enough to make every conversation a potential minefield. Phone calls were torture. Presentations in college had been nightmares that left her drenched in sweat. And now somehow, she had convinced herself that she could stand in front of classrooms full of teenagers and teach them about the beauty of language. The teaching certificate hanging in her apartment seemed like a cruel joke now. She checked her phone. 7:42 a.m. First period started at 8. Taking a deep breath that did nothing to calm her racing heart, Rebecca grabbed her worn leather messenger bag from the passenger seat and stepped out into the crisp October morning. Riverside High was one of those sprawling suburban schools built in the 1980s, all red brick and long corridors that seemed designed to make newcomers feel lost and insignificant. Rebecca had visited twice during the interview process, but walking through those doors as an actual employee felt entirely different. The hallways buzzed with the energy of 1,200 students who had already been in session for 6 weeks, their social hierarchies firmly established, their routines set in stone. Rebecca's classroom was on the second floor, room 247. She climbed the stairs slowly, nodding politely at the few teachers who acknowledged her presence. Most were rushing to their own classrooms, coffee cups in hand, looking like they'd rather be anywhere else on this Monday morning. At least she wasn't alone in that sentiment. Room 247 was small and cramped, with 32 desks crammed into a space meant for 25. The previous teacher, Mrs. Henderson, had retired mid-semester after 40 years in education, leaving behind outdated posters of Shakespeare and Edgar Allan Poe that gave the room a distinctly haunted feeling. Rebecca had arrived early every day for the past week, trying to make the space feel like her own, but it still felt like she was playing dress-up in someone else's life. She set her bag down on the scarred wooden desk and pulled out her lesson plans. First period, Advanced Placement Literature. These were supposed to be the motivated students, the ones who actually cared about learning. If she was going to survive anywhere, it would be here. The bell rang at exactly 8 o'clock, and they began filtering in. Rebecca's heart hammered against her ribs as she watched them settle into their seats. There was Emma Chun, the girl who had already read every book on the AP reading list. Marcus Johnson, who wrote poetry in his spare time and had been published in the school literary magazine. Sarah Williams, who wanted to be a journalist and asked impossibly thoughtful questions. These were good kids. Smart kids. Rebecca reminded herself of this as she stood up from behind her desk and walked to the front of the classroom. "Good morning, everyone," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm Miss Martinez, and I'll be your new English teacher." The stutter hit the M in Martinez like a brick wall. She felt her face flush red as a few students exchanged glances, but they remained polite, attentive. This wasn't so bad. Maybe she could do this after all. The morning progressed better than she had dared to hope. Her second period, American Literature. Class was equally well behaved, though she noticed a few students whispering when she stumbled over the word, particularly while discussing Nathaniel Hawthorne. By third period, word had apparently spread through the school's invisible communication network that the new English teacher had a speech impediment, but the students remained respectful. It was the fourth period when everything changed. Rebecca's fourth period class was officially called English 10, but everyone knew it was where they put the students who didn't fit anywhere else. The kids who were too smart for remedial classes, but too unmotivated for honors. The athletes who needed easy credits. The social butterflies who treated every class like an extension of lunch period. The troublemakers who had been kicked out of other sections. They slouched into room 247 like they owned the place, talking loudly over the bell, dropping their backpacks on the floor with deliberate thuds. Rebecca recognized the type immediately. These were the kids who could smell weakness from across a crowded hallway, who had turned cruelty into an art form, who would test every boundary and push every button until they found the thing that would break you. Standing at the front of the classroom, Rebecca felt like a gazelle who had wandered into a den of lions. "All right, everyone, please take your seats," she said, trying to project authority she didn't feel. Her voice came out thin and uncertain. A few students complied, but most continued their conversations as if she hadn't spoken. In the back corner, a group of boys were showing each other something on their phones and laughing. Near the windows, 3 girls were applying makeup and discussing weekend plans in voices loud enough to be heard in the next county. "Please," Rebecca tried again, raising her voice slightly. "We need to get street started." The stutter on started, cut through the room like a gunshot. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Heads turned. And in that moment of silence, Rebecca heard something that made her blood run cold. Barely suppressed laughter. It started as a snicker from somewhere in the middle of the room. Then a whispered comment she couldn't quite make out. Then more. Laughter, spreading like a virus through the classroom until it felt like the walls themselves were mocking her. Did she just? Someone whispered. "Oh my God, she can't even talk," came another voice. Rebecca felt her face burning. Her hands began to shake. This was her worst nightmare coming true in real time, played out in front of 30 teenagers who seemed to be enjoying every second of her humiliation. In the third row, a boy named Tyler Brennan leaned back in his chair with a smirk that could have cut glass. Tyler was 17 but looked older, with the kind of casual cruelty that came from being naturally gifted everything he tried. Star of the varsity basketball team, dating the head cheerleader, destined for a full scholarship to Ohio State. He was the kind of kid who had never experienced real failure, and therefore had no empathy for those who struggled. Sorry, Miss Martinez," Tyler said, deliberately exaggerating a fake stutter. "Could you repeat that? I didn't quite catch what you were saying." The classroom erupted. Students who had been trying to contain their laughter now let it flow freely. Even some of the quieter kids who normally wouldn't participate in such cruelty found themselves caught up in the moment, giggling behind their hands, Rebecca stood frozen at the front of the room, watching her teaching career crumble before it had even begun. This was exactly what she had feared, exactly what had kept her awake at night, exactly what had made her consider backing out of this job a dozen times over the past month. But something else was happening too, something the students couldn't see. Beneath the shame and embarrassment, beneath the urge to run out of the room and never come back, a different emotion was beginning to stir. It started as a warm sensation in her chest, then spread outward like liquid fire through her veins. Rebecca Martinez had spent her entire life being underestimated, overlooked, dismissed. She had endured cruel comments from classmates, patronizing attitudes from professors, and the constant assumption that someone who struggled with speech must also struggle with intelligence. She had accepted it all with quiet dignity, telling herself that this was simply her cross to bear. But standing in that classroom, watching these privileged teenagers mock her for something she couldn't control, Rebecca felt something she had never experienced before, pure, crystalline rage. What these students didn't know, what nobody at Riverside High knew, was that Rebecca Martinez had another life outside these walls. 3 nights a week for the past 8 years, she had been training at Master Kim's Taekwondo Academy on the south side of Columbus. What had started as a way to build confidence and self-discipline had become something much more. Rebecca was a 3rd-degree black belt, 2 victories away from qualifying for the national championships, and possessed a roundhouse kick that could split a concrete block in half. The woman these students saw as weak and vulnerable was actually one of the most lethal people in the building. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Tyler Brennan's performance was just getting started. Emboldened by the laughter of his classmates, he stood up from his desk and began walking toward the front of the classroom with exaggerated, jerky movements. Maybe we should all try to speak like our new teacher," he announced, his voice dripping with mock sympathy. "You know, so she feels more comfortable." The cruelty in the room reached a fever pitch. Students were recording on their phones now, undoubtedly planning to share this humiliation across social media within minutes. In the back row, Ashley Morrison, Tyler's girlfriend and the unofficial queen of the school's social hierarchy, was practically doubled over with laughter. "Tyler, stop," she managed to gasp between giggles. "You're going to make me pee my pants." But Tyler wasn't done. He had found his audience, and he was going to milk every second of it. He positioned himself directly in front of Rebecca's desk, close enough that she could smell his cologne and see the cruel satisfaction gleaming in his green eyes. "So, Miss Martinez," he continued, his fake stutter becoming more pronounced. "With each word, what B-book are we going to read today? Maybe something about the people who can't talk right." Rebecca's hands were trembling now, but not from fear. The rage that had been building in her chest was spreading through her entire body like molten lava. She could feel her heart pounding against her ribs, could feel the familiar surge of adrenaline that she knew so well from the dojang. "Sit down, Tyler," she managed to say, her voice barely audible. "What was that?" Tyler cupped his ear theatrically. "I can't understand you. Maybe you should speak up?" The classroom erupted again. Even students who had been quietly watching this spectacle were now openly laughing. Someone in the back row started a slow clap. Another student began making exaggerated stuttering sounds. Rebecca closed her eyes for a moment, trying to center herself the way Master Kim had taught her. She thought about the countless hours she had spent in that small dojang, learning to channel her frustration and pain into something powerful. She thought about the discipline, the respect, the way martial arts had taught her that true strength came from within. But when she opened her eyes and saw Tyler's smirking face just inches from her own, all of that discipline evaporated. "I said sit down," Rebecca repeated, her voice stronger now. Tyler's smirk widened. "Or what? You'll street saint stutter at me some more?" That's when Rebecca Martinez made a decision that would change everything. She looked Tyler directly in the eyes and said, in the clearest, most confident voice she had used all day, "Or I'll make you sit down." The laughter in the classroom faltered. Something in Rebecca's tone had shifted, something that made even the most oblivious students sense that the dynamic in the room was about to change dramatically. Tyler, however, was too caught up in his own performance to notice. "Oh, I'm so scared," he mocked, taking another step closer to Rebecca. "What are you going to do? Teach me about dangling participles?" Rebecca stood up from behind her desk. At 5'3", she was still 6 inches shorter than Tyler, but something about her posture had changed. Her shoulders were back, her chin was raised, and her brown eyes had taken on a steely quality that made several students in the front row unconsciously lean back in their seats. "Last warning," Rebecca said, her voice now carrying an edge that cut through the room like a blade. Tyler laughed, but it sounded forced now. "What are you going to do? Call the principal? Tell him the mean students are making fun of your he." Never got to finish the sentence. What happened next occurred so quickly that most of the students didn't even process it until it was over. Rebecca moved with the fluid grace of someone who had spent years perfecting her craft. Her right hand shot out in a lightning-fast strike that caught Tyler's wrist, just as he was gesturing mockingly at her. The pressure point technique she used, something Master Kim had taught her for self-defense, caused Tyler's entire arm to go numb instantly, but Rebecca wasn't finished. As Tyler stumbled backward in shock, she pivoted on her left foot and delivered a perfectly executed side kick to his solar plexus. The impact wasn't hard enough to cause serious injury, but it was precise enough to send Tyler stumbling backward into the row of desks behind him. The classroom fell silent. Tyler sat on the floor, clutching his stomach and staring up at Rebecca with a mixture of shock and confusion. His face had gone pale, and for the first time in his life, he seemed genuinely speechless. "Now," Rebecca said, her voice calm and steady, "would you like to take your seat?" Tyler scrambled to his feet, his earlier bravado completely evaporated. He stumbled back to his desk without saying a word, his eyes never leaving Rebecca's face. The other students watched in stunned silence as their tormentor, the boy who had terrorized underclassmen and dominated every social situation he entered meekly, sat down like a scolded child. Rebecca smoothed her skirt and walked back to her position at the front of the classroom. When she spoke again, her voice carried none of the uncertainty it had held just minutes before. "Now that we have that settled," she said, "let's talk about today's lesson. We're going to be studying character development in literature, specifically how authors use conflict to reveal hidden depths in their protagonists." She paused, letting her eyes sweep across the room. Every student was sitting up straight now, their attention focused entirely on her. "Can anyone give me an example of a character who appears weak or vulnerable at the beginning of a story, but who reveals unexpected strength when pushed to their limits?" The silence stretched for several seconds before a hand tentatively rose. In the middle of the room. It belonged to Marcus Chun, a quiet kid who usually sat in the back and never spoke unless directly addressed. Katniss Everdeen," he offered. "From the Hunger Games?" Rebecca smiled, the first genuine smile she had worn all day. "Excellent example, Marcus. Katniss appears to be just another teenager from District 12, but when her sister's life is threatened, she reveals herself to be a skilled hunter and eventual revolutionary. Can you think of what motivated that transformation?" Marcus sat up straighter, encouraged by Rebecca's positive response. She was protecting someone she loved. The threat to her sister made her find strength she didn't know she had. "Exactly," Rebecca said. "Sometimes we don't discover our true capabilities until we're pushed beyond our comfort zone. Until someone threatens something, or someone we care about deeply." She let that statement hang in the air for a moment, and several students shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The subtext was clear to everyone in the room. Now, Rebecca continued, let's talk about how authors use specific techniques to show character growth. Take out your notebooks and copy down these literary devices. She turned to the whiteboard and began writing with steady, confident strokes. Behind her, the classroom had transformed into something completely different from what it had been just minutes before. Students were actually taking notes. Tyler sat hunched over his desk, still rubbing his stomach and stealing glances at Rebecca when he thought she wasn't looking. Ashley Morrison had put away her phone and was copying down the notes with unusual diligence. The rest of the class, period, passed without incident. Rebecca moved through her lesson plan with growing confidence, fielding questions and facilitating discussions with the kind of natural authority she had never imagined she possessed. When the bell rang 45 minutes later, the students filed out quietly, many of them looking back at her with expressions of newfound respect. Tyler was the last to leave. He stopped at Rebecca's desk, his earlier arrogance replaced by something that might have been genuine remorse. "Miss Martinez," he said quietly, I'm sorry about earlier. That was really uncool of me." Rebecca looked up from her papers and studied his face. The apology seemed sincere, but she could see the confusion in his eyes. Tyler Brennan had never encountered someone who could flip the script on him so completely, and he was struggling to process what had just happened. "Apology accepted," Rebecca said simply. "But Tyler?" "Yes, ma'am?" "If you ever speak to me that way again, what happened today will seem like a gentle warning. Do we understand each other?" Tyler nodded rapidly. "Yes, ma'am, absolutely." After he left, Rebecca sat alone in her classroom, her hands finally beginning to shake as the adrenaline wore off. She had just physically confronted a student, something that could easily cost her job if the wrong people found out about it. But as she thought about the look of respect in her students' eyes as they left, she realized something profound had changed. For the first time in her life, Rebecca Martinez had stood up for herself. And it felt incredible. Word traveled fast at Riverside High. By lunch period, 3 different versions of what had happened in Rebecca's 4th period class were circulating through the cafeteria. The most popular version had her throwing Tyler across the room with some kind of ninja move. Another claimed she had knocked him unconscious with a single punch. The third, whispered in hushed tones near the vending machines, suggested that the quiet new English teacher might actually be some kind of undercover martial arts expert. Rebecca ate her sandwich alone in her classroom, trying to ignore the groups of students who kept walking past her open door, craning their necks to get a glimpse of the teacher who had taken down Tyler Brennan. She had 3 missed calls from the main office on her phone, but she wasn't ready to face Principal Davidson yet. She needed time to figure out how to explain what had happened without losing her job on her first day. The truth was, she wasn't entirely sure how to explain it herself. The woman who had confronted Tyler wasn't the same person who had walked into that classroom an hour earlier. Something fundamental had shifted inside her, and she was still trying to understand what it meant. Her planning period was interrupted by a soft knock on her door. Rebecca looked up to see Sarah Chen Marcus's older sister and the editor of the school newspaper, standing in the doorway with a notebook in her hand. "Miss Martinez, could I talk to you for a minute?" Rebecca gestured to the chair across from her desk. Sarah was a senior, one of those students who seemed older than her 18 years. She had the kind of quiet intelligence that made teachers pay attention when she spoke, and Rebecca had heard from other faculty members that Sarah was already being recruited by journalism programs at several prestigious universities. "I heard about what happened in 4th period," Sarah said, settling into the chair with the poise of someone conducting a professional interview. "I wanted to get your side of the story." Rebecca set down her sandwich and studied the girl's face. "Are you here as a student or as a journalist?" "Both," Sarah admitted. "But mostly as someone who's been waiting 3 years for somebody to put Tyler Brennan in his place." Rebecca couldn't help but smile at the girl's honesty. I'm not sure I should be discussing this with a student. Tyler's been bullying kids at this school since he was a freshman, Sarah continued, ignoring Rebecca's deflection. He's made at least 6 students transfer to other schools, and the administration has never done anything about it because he's their star basketball player. What you did today, ... It was the first time anyone has ever stood up to him. Rebecca leaned back in her chair, considering her words carefully. Sarah, I understand your frustration with Tyler's behavior, but what happened in my classroom wasn't appropriate. Teachers shouldn't resort to physical confrontation with students, even when those students are being cruel and abusive. The question hung in the air between them. Rebecca thought about Tyler's mocking Stutter, about the laughter of his classmates, about the phones recording her humiliation. She thought about all the times throughout her life when she had endured similar cruelty in silence, telling herself that it was better to be the bigger person, that responding would only make things worse. There are proper channels for dealing with student behavior issues, Rebecca said finally. Sarah snorted a sound that seemed out of character for such a composed young woman. Proper channels? Missy Martinez, do you know how many times Tyler has been reported to the administration? Do you know how many parents have complained about his behavior? And do you know what always happens? Rebecca remained silent, but Sarah continued anyway. Nothing, absolutely nothing. Because Tyler's father is on the school board, and Tyler is being scouted by Division I colleges, and nobody wants to be the person who ruins the Golden Boy's future over a little harmless teasing. The bitterness in Sarah's voice suggested personal experience. Rebecca found herself leaning forward, despite her better judgment. Did Tyler do something to you? Sarah's composure cracked slightly. Not to me directly, but my cousin Alex Chen. A sophomore. Tyler made his life hell for the first month of school. Alex is shy, kind of awkward, you know? He's into anime and computer programming, not exactly Tyler's crowd. Tyler started calling him China Boy and making jokes about his accent, even though Alex was born in Cleveland. Rebecca felt her stomach tighten. What happened? Alex stopped eating lunch. Started having panic attacks before school. My aunt found him crying in his room one night, saying he wanted to transfer schools because he couldn't handle coming here anymore. Sarah's hands were clenched into fists now. We reported it multiple times. And you know what Principal Davidson said? Rebecca could guess, but she let Sarah continue. He said boys will be boys, and Alex needed to toughen up if he wanted to survive high school. He suggested that maybe Alex should try out for a sport or join some clubs to fit in better. The injustice of it made Rebecca's chest tighten with familiar anger. How many times had she heard similar dismissals throughout her own school years? How many times have adults in positions of authority failed to protect the vulnerable students who needed them most? Where is Alex now? Rebecca asked. He switched to online school last month. My aunt pulled him out rather than watch him suffer anymore. Sarah's voice was steady, but Rebecca could see the tears forming in her eyes. That's why what you did today matters. For the first time in 3 years, Tyler Brennan got a taste of what it feels like to be humiliated in front of his peers. For the first time, somebody showed him that actions have consequences. Before Rebecca could respond, her phone buzzed with a text message. Principal Davidson, please come to my office immediately. Rebecca's stomach dropped. The moment of reckoning had arrived. I have to go, she said, standing up and gathering her things. Sarah stood as well. Miss Martinez? Whatever happens in that meeting, just know that there are a lot of students in this school who are grateful for what you did today. Tyler might be popular with his crowd, but he's made enemies of a lot of other people. You're not alone in this. Walking down the hallway toward the main office, Rebecca felt like she was marching toward her own execution. The administrative wing of Riverside High was quieter than the rest of the school, carpeted in industrial beige and lined with motivational posters that seemed to mock her current situation. "Reach for the stars," proclaimed one. "Every child deserves respect," declared another. Principal Davidson's secretary barely looked up as Rebecca approached. "He's waiting for you," she said, gesturing toward the closed office door. Rebecca knocked and entered to find Principal Davidson sitting behind his massive oak desk, his expression unreadable. Richard Davidson was a man in his late 50s who had spent his entire career in education, working his way up from gym teacher to administrator. He had the thick build of a former athlete and the weary expression of someone who had dealt with every conceivable crisis that could occur in a high school setting. Sitting in the chairs across from his desk were two people Rebecca didn't recognize. A woman in an expensive-looking business suit and a man who could only be Tyler's father, based on their identical green eyes and strong jawlines. "Miss Martinez," Principal Davidson said, his voice carefully neutral, "please have a seat. I believe you know why you're here." Rebecca sat in the remaining empty chair, her heart pounding. "I assume this is about the incident in my fourth period." "Class incident," repeated the woman in the suit, her voice dripping with disdain. "Is that what we're calling it when a teacher assaults a student?" "I'm sorry," Rebecca said, "but I don't believe we've been introduced." "Patricia Brennan," the woman replied curtly, "Tyler's mother. And this is my husband, Robert. We're here because our son came home today with bruises on his arm and chest, claiming that his new English teacher attacked him for no reason." Rebecca felt her face flush. "That's not exactly what happened." "Then please," said Robert Brennan, speaking for the first time, "tell us exactly what did happen. Because from where we're sitting, it looks like you physically assaulted our son. In front of his entire class." Rebecca looked at Principal Davidson, hoping for some sign of support, but his expression remained professionally blank. She realized that she was completely on her own. "Tyler was disrupting my class," she began. "Carefully. He was being disrespectful and making fun of my speech impediment. When I asked him to stop and take his seat, he refused and became increasingly aggressive. So you decided to hit him." Patricia Brennan's voice rose slightly. "I used a defensive technique to create space between us," Rebecca corrected. "Tyler was standing very close to me, making threatening gestures, and I felt the need to protect myself." "Threatening gestures?" Robert Brennan stood up, his face reddening. "Tyler is 17 years old. What possible threat could he pose to an adult?" Rebecca thought about Tyler's size advantage, about the way he had invaded her personal space, about the cruel satisfaction in his eyes as he mocked her stutter. She thought about all the students who had transferred schools to escape his bullying, about Alex Chen crying in his bedroom, about the culture of impunity that allowed cruelty to flourish unchecked. "Your son," she said quietly, "was systematically humiliating me in front of 30 other students. He was making fun of a disability I can't control, encouraging others to do the same, and becoming increasingly aggressive when I asked him to stop. I did what I felt was necessary to regain control of my classroom. By assaulting a minor," Patricia Brennan shot back, "we could have you arrested for this." Rebecca's heart sank. She had expected this. Of course, Tyler's friends would back up his version of events. The social dynamics of high school hadn't changed her own teenage years. The popular kids protected each other, and teachers were expendable. However, Principal Davidson continued, raising a hand to silence Patricia Brennan's objection, "I've also received some very interesting phone calls this afternoon." Robert Brennan shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "What kind of phone calls?" "The first was from Mrs. Helen Rodriguez, whose daughter Maria was in Miss Martinez's class today. According to Mrs. Rodriguez, Maria came home excited about school. For the first time in months. Apparently, Maria has been the target of bullying from several students in that class, including your son Tyler." Patricia Brennan's face reddened. "That's ridiculous. Tyler doesn't bully anyone. The second call, Principal Davidson continued, ignoring the interruption, was from Dr. James Patel. His son Arjun has been having anxiety attacks about attending school. Dr. Patel wanted to thank Miss Martinez for finally addressing the hostile environment in that classroom. Rebecca blinked in surprise. She barely remembered Maria Rodriguez, a quiet girl who sat in the middle of the room, and she wasn't sure she could have picked Arjun Patel out of a lineup. But apparently, her confrontation with Tyler had meant more to these students than she had realized. I also received a call from Sarah Chun, Principal Davidson said, his eyes moving to Robert Brennan. As you know, Sarah is one of our most respected students and the editor of our school newspaper. She's requesting an interview with Miss Martinez about what she calls the culture of bullying that has been allowed to flourish at Riverside High. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Robert Brennan's face had gone pale, and Patricia was clutching her purse so tightly her knuckles were white. Furthermore, Principal Davidson continued, I've been reviewing Tyler's disciplinary file this afternoon. It makes for very interesting reading. He opened a thick manila folder and began reading from it. September 15th, Tyler Brennan reported for making inappropriate comments about a female student's appearance. Warning issued. September 28th, Tyler Brennan and 3 other students accused of cornering a freshman in the bathroom and demanding his lunch money. No action taken due to lack of witnesses. October 5th, Tyler Brennan reported for using racial slurs during lunch period. Sensitivity training recommended, but never completed. With each entry, Robert Brennan seemed to shrink further into his chair. Patricia had stopped protesting and was staring at her hands. October 12th, Tyler Brennan accused of deliberately tripping a student with a walking disability. Student transferred to another school before the investigation could be completed. October 18th, Tyler Brennan reported for cyberbullying via social media. Parents contacted, but did not respond to requests for a meeting. Principal Davidson closed the folder and looked directly at Tyler's parents. This file contains 43 separate incidents over the past 3 years. 43 times your son has been reported for bullying, harassment, or aggressive behavior. And in almost every case, no meaningful action was taken. The silence that followed was deafening. Rebecca could hear her own heartbeat in her ears. That's impossible, Patricia finally whispered. We would have been notified. You were notified, Principal Davidson said firmly. Multiple times. Letters were sent home. Phone calls were made. Meeting requests were issued. And consistently, you either didn't respond or you dismissed the complaints as teenage drama, or boys being boys. Robert Brennan found his voice again, though it was notably less confident than before. Even if that's true, it doesn't give this teacher the right to put her hands on our son. You're absolutely right, Principal Davidson said, turning to Rebecca. Miss Martinez, what you did today was completely inappropriate. Teachers cannot and should not use physical force against students, regardless of the provocation. Rebecca felt her stomach drop. This was it. She was going to be fired, possibly arrested, and her teaching career would be over before it had truly begun. However, Principal Davidson continued, I'm not going to recommend your termination. Everyone in the room stared at him in shock. Instead, I'm going to recommend that you be placed on administrative leave for the remainder of this week while we conduct a full investigation into the incident. During that time, you will attend anger management counseling and conflict resolution training. When you return, you will be on probation for the remainder of the school year. Patricia Brennan shot to her feet. That's completely unacceptable. This woman attacked our son. Mrs. Brennan, Principal Davidson said, his voice taking on a steel edge. Your son has terrorized students at the school for 3 years. He has caused at least 4 students to transfer to other schools. He has created a hostile learning environment that has interfered with the education of dozens of his peers. And today, he chose to target a teacher who has a documented speech impediment, mocking her disability in front of an entire classroom. He stood up, his full height making him an imposing figure behind his desk. If you want to pursue legal action against Miss Martinez, that is your right. But I will be compelled to provide testimony about Tyler's pattern of behavior, and I will be recommending that he be transferred to an alternative education program where his conduct can be more closely monitored. The threat was clear. Robert and Patricia Brennan could push this issue, but it would mean exposing Tyler's extensive history of bullying to legal scrutiny. More importantly, it would mean jeopardizing Tyler's basketball career and his college scholarships. Robert Brennan stood up slowly, his jaw clenched. "This isn't over." "Yes, it is," Principal Davidson replied calmly. "Tyler will be suspended for 3 days for his conduct today. When he returns, he will be placed in a different English class, and he will be required to attend weekly counseling sessions with our school psychologist. If there are any further incidents involving Tyler, he will be immediately transferred to Valley View Alternative School." Valley View was the district school for students with serious behavioral problems. It was where careers and college dreams went to die. The threat was enough to make both parents reconsider their position. "Fine," Patricia said through gritted teeth, "but we want a formal apology from Miss Martinez." Rebecca looked at Principal Davidson, who nodded slightly. She took a deep breath and faced Tyler's parents. "I apologize for using physical force in the classroom today," she said carefully. "It was not appropriate, and I understand why you're upset. However, I will not apologize for defending myself against your son's cruel and abusive behavior." It wasn't the groveling apology the Brennans had expected, but it was all they were going to get. After a few more minutes of tense discussion about the details of Tyler's suspension, they left the office, their expensive shoes clicking angrily on the tile floor. When they were gone, Principal Davidson sank back into his chair and rubbed his temples. "Miss Martinez, I want to be very clear about something," he said. "What you did today was wrong. I cannot and will not condone teachers using physical force against students, regardless of the circumstances." Rebecca nodded, expecting the lecture that would follow. "But," he continued, "I've been an educator for 32 years, and I've never seen a teacher stand up to a bully the way you did today. Right or wrong, you accomplished something in that classroom that 3 years of administrative intervention couldn't achieve." Tyler Brennan finally faced consequences for his actions. He opened his desk drawer and pulled out a small digital recorder. "For the record, this conversation is being recorded, and my official position is that your actions were unacceptable and that you are being disciplined accordingly." He clicked off the recorder and looked directly at Rebecca. "Off the record? Tyler Brennan has had cancer in this school for years. His parents have used their money and influence to shield him from accountability, and good kids have suffered because of it. What you did today may have been inappropriate, but it was also necessary." Rebecca felt tears welling up in her eyes. "I don't want to lose my job over this." "You won't," Principal Davidson assured her. "But you need to understand that there will be people who will try to make your life difficult. The Brennans have friends on the school board, and they're not going to forget this humiliation easily. You'll need to be perfect from now on. No mistakes, no controversies, nothing they can use against you." He handed her a business card. "This is Dr. Angela Foster. She's the counselor you'll be working with during your suspension. She's also the person who helped me develop the anti-bullying protocols that should have been implemented years ago." Rebecca took the card, her hand still trembling slightly. "What happens now?" "Now you go home and rest. You'll start your administrative leave tomorrow and you'll return to work on Monday. When you do, you'll find that your 4th period class has been significantly restructured. Several students, including Tyler, will be moved to other sections." "Principal." Davidson walked her to the door of his office. "Miss Martinez?" "Thank you. What you did today was messy and complicated and against every rule in the book. But for the first time in 3 years, I believe Tyler Brennan is going to think twice before he decides to torment another student." As Rebecca walked through the empty hallways toward the parking lot, she passed several students who were still in the building for after-school activities. A few of them nodded respectfully as she passed. One girl, Maria Rodriguez, she realized actually smiled and gave her a small wave. Outside, the October air was crisp and clean, and Rebecca took her first deep breath in hours. Her career was intact, but barely. She had made powerful enemies, but she had also earned the respect of students who had never had anyone stand up for them before. Most importantly, she had finally learned what it felt like to use her voice and her strength to protect not just herself, but others who couldn't protect themselves. Rebecca's suspension week passed in a blur of mandatory counseling sessions and paperwork. Dr. Angela Foster turned out to be nothing like what Rebecca had expected. Instead of the stern disciplinarian she had imagined, Dr. Foster was a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and an infectious laugh who had spent 15 years as a high school teacher before becoming a counselor specializing in workplace conflict resolution. Their first session took place in Dr. Foster's small office downtown, decorated with plants and soft lighting that felt more like a living room than a clinical space. "So," Dr. Foster said, settling into her chair with a steaming cup of tea, "tell me about Master Kim." Rebecca blinked in surprise. "I'm sorry? Your martial arts instructor. Principal Davidson mentioned that you have extensive training in Taekwondo. I'm curious about how that training shaped your response to Tyler's behavior." Rebecca shifted uncomfortably. She had expected to be lectured about appropriate teacher conduct, not asked about her martial arts background. "Master Kim always taught us that martial arts should be used for protection, not aggression," Rebecca said carefully. "The goal is to avoid conflict whenever possible, but to be prepared to defend yourself or others when necessary." Dr. Foster nodded thoughtfully. "And did you feel that you were defending yourself when you confronted Tyler?" "Yes, but ... Rebecca paused, trying to articulate something she was still processing herself. "It wasn't just about me. Tyler has been hurting other students for years. At that moment, it felt like I was standing up for all of them, too." "That's interesting," Dr. Foster said, making a note. "Tell me more about that feeling." Over the next hour, Rebecca found herself talking about things she had never discussed with anyone: her years of enduring mockery for her stutter, her decision to study martial arts as a way to build confidence, her choice to become a teacher. Despite her speech impediment, Dr. Foster listened without judgment, occasionally asking questions that helped Rebecca understand her own motivations more clearly. "Rebecca," Dr. Foster said as their session wound down, "I need to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest. Do you regret what you did?" Rebecca considered the question carefully. "I regret that it came to that point. I regret that the situation escalated to physical confrontation. But do I regret standing up to Tyler? No, I don't." Dr. Foster smiled. "Good, because if you had said yes, I would have been worried about you." Meanwhile, back at Riverside High, Rebecca's absence had created unexpected ripple effects throughout the school. The story of what happened in fourth period had evolved and spread, taking on mythical proportions with each retelling. Some versions had Rebecca performing impossible martial arts feats. Others claimed she had single-handedly revolutionized the school's approach to bullying. But the most significant changes were happening among the students themselves. On Tuesday, Maria Rodriguez approached Alex Chen's younger brother Danny during lunch period. Danny was a freshman who had been enduring Tyler's jokes about his height and appearance since school started. "Hey," Maria said, sitting down across from him at an otherwise empty table. "I heard Tyler's been giving you a hard time." Danny looked around nervously as if Tyler might materialize at any moment. "I don't want to cause any trouble." "You're not causing trouble," Maria assured him. "Tyler is. And after what happened with Miss Martinez, I think it's time we stopped letting him get away with it." Word of Maria's conversation with Danny spread quickly through the school's network of overlooked students, the kids who ate lunch alone, who got shoved in hallways, who had learned to make themselves invisible to avoid Tyler's attention. By Wednesday, something unprecedented was happening. They were talking to each other. Sarah Chun documented the phenomenon in a series of articles for the school newspaper that would later be picked up by the Columbus Dispatch. Students who had never spoken before were forming study groups. Kids who had been isolated were finding friends who understood their experiences. The culture of fear that Tyler had maintained through intimidation was cracking. Tyler himself was dealing with his own crisis. His 3-day suspension had been extended when his parents discovered he had been posting cruel memes about various students on social media, something that came to light during the investigation into his behavior. His basketball coach had benched him indefinitely pending a review by the athletic department. College scouts who had been courting him were suddenly returning his calls more slowly. Most devastating of all, his social status at school was crumbling. The video of Rebecca's takedown, recorded by one of his friends and initially intended to humiliate the teacher, had backfired spectacularly. Instead of making Rebecca look bad, it showed Tyler at his worst: cruel, arrogant, and ultimately powerless when faced with real consequences. Ashley Morrison, his girlfriend, had broken up with him via text message on Wednesday. "I can't be with someone who thinks it's funny to mock disabled people," she wrote. "What you did to Miss Martinez was disgusting." The irony wasn't lost on Tyler that Ashley herself had laughed at Rebecca's stutter during the incident. But public opinion had shifted so dramatically that even Tyler's closest allies were distancing themselves from him. On Thursday, Rebecca received an unexpected visitor during her counseling session. Principal Davidson knocked on Dr. Foster's office door with a manila envelope in his hand. "I'm sorry to interrupt," he said, "but I thought you should see this immediately." He handed Rebecca a petition signed by 347 students, nearly a third of the school's population, requesting that she be reinstated immediately and commending her for finally standing up to the bullying that has made our school a hostile environment for too many students. Rebecca stared at the document in disbelief. She recognized many of the names, not just from her own classes, but from throughout the school. These were students she had never even spoken to, kids who had somehow learned about her story and decided to take a stand. "There's more," Principal Davidson said, pulling out a second document. The school board received a formal complaint about Tyler's behavior from 8 different families. They're demanding a full investigation into how his conduct was handled over the past 3 years. Dr. Foster whistled softly. "That's going to create some serious problems for people who covered for him." "It already has," Principal Davidson confirmed. 3 board members are calling for a review of our anti-bullying policies. The district superintendent wants to meet with Rebecca when she returns to discuss implementing new teacher training programs. Rebecca felt overwhelmed. "I just wanted to teach English literature." "And you will," Principal Davidson assured her. "But what happened in your classroom has started something bigger than just one incident between a teacher and a student. You've given voice to students who thought nobody would listen to them." That evening, Rebecca received a phone call that would stay with her for the rest of her career. The voice on the other end was young and uncertain. "Miss Martinez?" "This is Alex Chun, Sarah's cousin." Rebecca remembered Sarah's story about her cousin who had transferred to online school to escape Tyler's harassment. "I wanted to thank you," Alex continued, his voice growing stronger as he spoke. "What you did. It made me realize that I wasn't wrong to be upset about how Tyler treated me. My parents always told me to just ignore bullies, but watching that, Video made me understand that sometimes you have to fight back. Alex, Rebecca said gently, I don't want you to think that physical confrontation is always the answer. That's not what I mean, Alex interrupted. I mean fight back by not staying silent. I called Principal Davidson yesterday and told him everything Tyler did to me. Not because I want revenge, but because maybe it will help protect other kids. Rebecca felt tears welling up in her eyes. That took a lot of courage. So did what you did, Alex replied. My sister says you were scared when Tyler was making fun of you, but you stood up to him anyway. That's what real bravery looks like. After hanging up, Rebecca sat in her small apartment and reflected on the week that had changed everything. In 7 days, she had gone from being an unknown substitute teacher to being at the center of a school-wide movement against bullying. Students were finding their voices, parents were demanding accountability, and administrators were finally being forced to address problems they had ignored for years. The woman who had walked into room 247 just a week ago, the one who had trembled at the thought of speaking in front of teenagers, felt like a stranger now. Rebecca had discovered something about herself that she never knew existed. When pushed to her limit, when faced with injustice, she was capable of extraordinary courage. More importantly, she had learned that courage was contagious. Her moment of defiance had inspired others to find their own strength, to speak up for themselves and each other, to refuse to accept cruelty as just part of growing up. As she prepared for her return to school on Monday, Rebecca realized that Tyler Brennan had given her an unexpected gift. In trying to humiliate her, he had forced her to discover who she really was beneath the stutter and the fear. And in the process, she had helped dozens of other students discover the same thing about themselves. The quiet English teacher who loved literature was still there, but now she was joined by someone new, a woman who would never again allow cruelty to go unchallenged, who understood that sometimes the most important lessons happened outside the curriculum, and who knew that finding your voice was worth any risk. Monday morning arrived with an unseasonable warmth for late October. Rebecca sat in her car outside Riverside High, watching the familiar stream of students flowing through the entrance. But something was different today. Students who had previously walked with hunched shoulders and downcast eyes were standing taller. Groups that had never interacted before were walking together, deep in animated conversations. The change was subtle but unmistakable. The atmosphere of the school itself had shifted. Rebecca took a deep breath and gathered her things. She had spent the weekend preparing for this moment, rehearsing what she would say if confronted, planning how to handle the inevitable stares and whispers. But as she walked through the main entrance, something unexpected happened. Students began to applaud. It started with Marcus Chun, who was standing near the trophy case with several other students. He began clapping slowly, deliberately. Then Sarah joined in, followed by Maria Rodriguez and her group of friends. Within seconds, dozens of students throughout the main hallway were applauding, some calling out words of encouragement. Thank you, Miss Martinez, you're a hero. Finally, someone stood up to him. Rebecca felt her cheeks burning with embarrassment and pride. She had never experienced anything like this, being celebrated instead of pitied, being seen as strong instead of weak. She nodded her thanks to the students and made her way quickly to her classroom, but the applause followed her up the stairs. Room 247 looked exactly the same as she had left it, but it felt completely different. Rebecca arranged her materials for the day and waited for the first period to begin. Her hands were steady now, she realized. The tremor that had plagued her for years was gone. Her first period, a P literature class, filed in with obvious excitement. These were the students who had witnessed her transformation from a stammering substitute to someone who commanded respect, and they were eager to see how the story would continue. Good morning, everyone, Rebecca said, her voice clear and confident. Not a trace of a stutter. Emma Chun raised her hand immediately. Miss Martinez, we're really glad you're back. A lot of us were worried that you might not come back at all." Rebecca smiled. "It takes more than one difficult week to get rid of me. Now let's talk about what you've been reading while I was away." The class proceeded smoothly, but Rebecca could sense an undercurrent of anticipation. Everyone knew that. The real test would come in the fourth period, her restructured class that no longer included Tyler Brennan but still contained many of the students who had witnessed the incident. Second and third periods passed without incident, though Rebecca noticed more students than usual lingering after class to ask questions or simply to chat. Word had spread that she was approachable now in a way she hadn't been before, that her experience with Tyler had somehow made her more relatable rather than less dotted lunch. Rebecca was surprised to find Sarah Chun waiting outside her classroom with a small group of students she didn't recognize. "Miss Martinez," Sarah said, "these are some students from the journalism club. We've been working on a series of articles about bullying at Riverside, and we were wondering if you'd be willing to be interviewed." Rebecca looked at the eager faces before her kids who had clearly spent considerable time preparing for this moment. "I'm not sure that's appropriate, Sarah. This is still a very sensitive situation." "We understand," said a tall boy with dark hair who introduced himself as Jordan Williams. "But what happened in your classroom has started something important. Students are talking about their experiences for the first time. They're reporting incidents that they used to just accept. The whole culture of the school is changing." A girl with short red hair stepped forward. "I'm Casey Murphy, and I've been documenting the Tyler Brennan situation for 3 years. Not just what he did to other students, but how the administration handled it. Or didn't handle it. Your story is part of a much bigger pattern." Rebecca considered this carefully. "What would you want to ask me?" "Mostly about what it felt like to finally stand up to him," Jordan said. "And what advice you might have for other students who are dealing with bullying." Before Rebecca could respond, the bell rang, signaling the end of lunch period. "We can discuss this later," she told the group. "Right now I need to prepare for the fourth period." As the students dispersed, Sarah lingered for a moment. "Miss Martinez, whatever happens in there today, just know that you already won. Tyler's reign of terror is over, and it's because you had the courage to say, 'Enough.'" Fourth period arrived with all the anticipation of a championship game. Students filed into room 247 with an unusual quiet, as if they understood they were about to witness something significant. Tyler's empty desk in the third row served as a visible reminder of how much had changed in just 1 week. Rebecca stood at the front of the classroom and looked out at the 26 faces before her. Some belonged to students who had laughed at her stutter. Others belonged to kids who had been victims of Tyler's cruelty. All of them were watching her with a mixture of curiosity and respect. "Before we begin today's lesson," Rebecca said, her voice carrying easily to the back of the room, "I want to address what happened here last week." The room was so quiet that Rebecca could hear the heating system cycling on. "What I did was not appropriate," she continued. "Teachers should not use physical force against students, regardless of the circumstances. I've been disciplined for my actions, and I accept that responsibility." She paused, making eye contact with several students. "However, I want you to understand something important. What Tyler was doing, mocking someone for a disability they can't control, encouraging others to join in, creating an environment where cruelty is considered entertainment, that behavior is also unacceptable. More than unacceptable, it's wrong." Maria Rodriguez raised her hand tentatively. "Miss Martinez, a lot of us didn't speak up that day because we were scared. We're sorry about that." "You don't need to apologize to me," Rebecca said gently. "But you might need to apologize to yourselves. Every time we stay silent when we witness cruelty, we give it permission to continue. Every time we laugh along with bullies, we become complicit in their actions." A boy named Jamie Peterson, who had been one of Tyler's followers, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. What if you're scared of becoming a target yourself? It was an honest question, and Rebecca respected him for asking it. That's a real fear, Jamie, but I've learned something important over the past week. When you stand up to bullies, you don't face them alone. Look around this room. Look at how many people were affected by Tyler's behavior. When one person finds the courage to speak up, others follow. She gestured toward the empty desk. Tyler seemed powerful because he was loud and aggressive and willing to hurt people. But real power comes from protecting others, not harming them. Real strength comes from lifting people up, not tearing them down. As if summoned by her words, there was a knock on the classroom door. Principal Davidson entered, followed by a woman Rebecca didn't recognize, someone in her 50s with gray hair and kind eyes. "Excuse the interruption," Principal Davidson said. "This is Dr. Sandra Walsh from the district office. She'd like to observe your class today." Rebecca felt a moment of panic. Was this another investigation? Had the school board decided to remove her after all? But Dr. Walsh smiled warmly and took a seat in the back of the room. "Please continue with your lesson, Miss Martinez. Don't mind me." Rebecca turned back to her students, many of whom looked as confused as she felt. "Well," she said, "I suppose we should actually teach some English literature now." She had planned to continue their unit on character development, but inspiration struck her. Walking to the whiteboard, she wrote a single word: courage. "Can anyone give me a definition of courage?" she asked. Hands shot up around the room. For the next 40 minutes, Rebecca led the most engaged discussion she had ever experienced as a teacher. Students talked about characters from literature who had shown courage in different ways. They discussed the difference between physical bravery and moral courage. They debated whether courage required action or whether sometimes it was enough to simply refuse to participate in wrongdoing. The conversation was so animated that no one noticed when the bell rang. Students continued talking as they gathered their things, many lingering to continue discussions that had started in class. After the last student left, Dr. Walsh approached Rebecca's desk. "Miss Martinez," she said, "I've been an educator for 28 years, and I've rarely seen a teacher handle a difficult situation with such grace and wisdom. Principal Davidson tells me that you're interested in developing anti-bullying curricula for the district." Rebecca blinked in surprise. I hadn't heard about that." Principal Davidson stepped forward. "It's something we discussed during your suspension. The district is looking for teachers who understand both the academic and social-emotional aspects of education. What happened here has shown us that you have unique insights into both." Dr. Walsh nodded. "We'd like to offer you the opportunity to pilot a new program next semester, one that integrates literature, study with social justice themes, and conflict resolution skills. You'd work with classes throughout the district, training other teachers and developing materials that could be used statewide." Rebecca sat down heavily in her chair. A week ago, she had been a terrified substitute teacher who could barely manage her own classroom. Now she was being offered the chance to influence education policy across the entire district. I need some time to think about this," she said. "Of course," Dr. Walsh replied. "But I hope you'll consider it. What you've accomplished here, not just with Tyler, but with the entire school culture, is exactly the kind of change we need to see everywhere." After they left, Rebecca sat alone in her classroom as the afternoon sun streamed through the windows. Her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Miss Martinez, this is Alex Chun. I just wanted you to know that I'm enrolling back at Riverside next semester. Thank you for making it a place where kids like me can feel safe." Rebecca smiled and put her phone away. Outside her window, she could see groups of students talking animatedly in the courtyard. The fear that had once hung over the school like a fog was lifting, replaced by something she had never expected to see in a high school. Hope. She thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment, from a frightened young woman who could barely speak in public to someone who was being asked to shape the future of education. The transformation hadn't happened overnight, and it hadn't been easy. But it was worth it. Rebecca Martinez had finally found her voice. And in doing so, she had helped an entire school find theirs. 6 months later, Rebecca Martinez stood in front of the largest auditorium at the Ohio State Education Center, looking out at an audience of over 800 teachers, administrators, and education policymakers from across the state. The woman who had once trembled at the thought of speaking to 30 teenagers was now preparing to deliver the keynote address at the Ohio Anti-Bullying Education Summit. But this story isn't about that moment. It's about what happened in the weeks and months that followed her return to Riverside High. Because the real transformation wasn't Rebecca's, it was the school's. By December, the changes at Riverside were impossible to ignore. The hallways that had once echoed with cruel laughter and whispered insults were filled with different sounds. Students actually helping each other with homework. Underclassmen walk in confidently instead of scurrying between classes and conversations. That built people up instead of tearing them down. The statistics told part of the story. Disciplinary referrals for bullying incidents dropped by 73% in the months following Tyler's suspension. Student transfers out of the district, previously running at nearly 20 per semester, fell to just 3. Perhaps most remarkably, academic performance across all grade levels showed measurable improvement as students who had been spending their energy on survival could finally focus on learning. But the numbers only captured part of what was happening. The real story was in the individual lives that had been changed. Danny Chun, Alex's younger brother, joined the debate team and discovered he had a gift for public speaking. Maria Rodriguez started a peer mentoring program that paired upperclassmen with freshmen who were struggling socially. Jamie Peterson, Tyler's former follower, became one of the most active participants in the school's new conflict resolution program, using his experience to help other students understand how easy it was to get caught up in cruelty. Even some of Tyler's former victims found ways to transform their experiences into positive change. Arjun Patel, whose anxiety attacks had nearly driven him out of school, started a support group for students dealing with social anxiety. His father, Dr. Patel, later told Principal Davidson that Arjun's confidence had grown so much that he was considering running for student government. Tyler himself had transferred to a private school across town, where his parents hoped a smaller environment and more individual attention might help him develop better social skills. Reports from his new school suggested he was struggling to adjust to an environment where his previous tactics didn't work and where his reputation hadn't preceded him. But perhaps the most significant change was in the teaching staff itself. Rebecca's experience had sparked conversations among faculty members that had been long overdue. Teachers began talking openly about the pressure they felt to ignore behavioral problems in order to avoid conflict with influential parents. They discussed the toll that workplace bullying, which existed among adults just as much as students, had taken on their effectiveness and job satisfaction. Principal Davidson used Rebecca's situation as a catalyst to implement comprehensive policy changes. New protocols were established for reporting and investigating bullying incidents. Teachers received training in de-escalation techniques and conflict resolution. Most importantly, a clear message was sent that no student, regardless of their family status or their value to athletic programs, was above accountability. The school board, faced with mounting pressure from parents and negative media attention, had quietly asked for the resignation of 2 members who had consistently blocked anti-bullying initiatives. The new board leadership allocated funding for additional counselors and implemented regular climate surveys to monitor the school environment. Rebecca had accepted the district position, spending 3 days a week developing curriculum and training teachers while maintaining her English classes at Riverside for the remaining 2 days. Her pilot program, Literature and Leadership, Building Character Through Conflict, was being tested in 12 schools across the district with remarkable results. The program used classic and contemporary literature to explore themes of courage, integrity, and social responsibility. Students read books like To Kill a Mockingbird, The Hate You Give, and Wonder, then participated in structured discussions about how the characters' choices related to their own lives and school experiences. But it was during one of these literature discussions that Rebecca experienced the moment that would stay with her forever. It was a Tuesday in March, and Rebecca was leading a discussion about Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird with a mixed group of students from 3 different high schools. They were analyzing Atticus Finch's decision to defend Tom Robinson despite social pressure and personal risk. "Why do you think Atticus chose to take the case?" Rebecca asked the group. A quiet girl from the back of the room raised her hand. Rebecca recognized her from the file photos. Emma Walsh, a sophomore from Westfield High, who had been the target of severe cyberbullying before transferring schools. Because he knew that doing the right thing was more important than doing the easy thing, Emma said. Even when everyone around him was telling him he was wrong, he knew he couldn't live with himself if he didn't try to help someone who had no one else to defend them. Rebecca nodded encouragingly. "Can you think of a time when you faced a similar choice?" Emma hesitated for a moment, then took a deep breath. "Last week, there was this kid in my new school who was getting picked on because he's different. And I remembered your story about how you stood up to that bully, even though you were scared. So I went over and sat with him at lunch." She paused, her voice growing stronger. "It wasn't like in a movie where suddenly everyone clapped and everything was perfect, but he wasn't alone anymore. And the kids who were being mean stopped because they realized people were watching, and they weren't just going to get away with it." A boy from another school spoke up. "That's like what Atticus says about how you never really understand a person until you consider things from their point of view. The bullies probably never thought about how their victim felt until someone made them think about it." The discussion that followed was unlike anything Rebecca had experienced in her years of teaching. Students who had never met before were sharing personal stories, connecting literature to their own experiences, and developing genuine empathy for each other's struggles. After the session ended, Rebecca was approached by Dr. Martinez, no relation, the district's curriculum coordinator who had been observing the class. "Rebecca, I've been teaching for 15 years, and I've never seen students engage with literature the way they do in your program," she said. "You're not just teaching them to analyze text, you're teaching them to analyze life." Dr. Martinez handed her a letter from the State Education Department. "They want you to present your program to the legislature next month. There's talk of making it a statewide requirement." That evening, Rebecca returned to Master Kim's dojang for the first time since the incident at school. She had been so busy with her new responsibilities that she had let her training lapse, but something was calling her back to the place where she had first learned about inner strength. Master Kim, a soft-spoken man in his 60s who had immigrated from South Korea 30 years earlier, welcomed her back with his characteristic gentle smile. "I heard about what happened at your school," he said as Rebecca changed into her training uniform. "I also heard about the good things that came after." They worked through forms in comfortable silence for a while before Master Kim spoke again. "You know, when I first started teaching martial arts, I thought it was about fighting, about learning to defeat your opponents." He paused in his movements. "But after many years, I realized that true martial arts is about something else entirely." "What's that?" Rebecca asked. "It's about becoming the kind of person who doesn't need to fight because others choose not to fight them. It's about having such strong character that your presence alone makes people want to be better." Rebecca thought about Tyler, who was reportedly doing better at his new school now that he was in an environment that didn't reward his previous behavior. She thought about the students in her literature classes who were learning to see themselves as heroes of their own stories rather than victims of other people's cruelty. You did something very important that day in your classroom, Master Kim continued. Not because you used physical techniques, but because you showed everyone, including yourself, that kindness is not the same as weakness. That having a gentle spirit doesn't mean you have to accept abuse. As Rebecca drove home that night, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. The woman who had sat in her car outside Riverside High just 6 months ago, terrified of facing a classroom full of teenagers, felt like a different person entirely. But the truth was, she wasn't different, she was just finally herself. The courage had always been there, hidden beneath years of self-doubt and social conditioning that told her to stay quiet, to avoid conflict, to accept poor treatment rather than risk making waves. Her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. She pulled over to read it safely. "Miss Martinez, this is Tyler Brennan. I know I probably don't have the right to contact you, but I wanted you to know that I'm getting help with my anger issues, and I'm really sorry for what I did to you and all those other kids. You probably won't believe this, but what happened that day was the best thing that ever happened to me, because it made me realize I was becoming someone I didn't want to be. Thank you for having the courage to stop me." Rebecca stared at the message for a long time. She thought about responding, but decided that some things were better left as they were. Tyler's journey toward becoming a better person was his own to make, just as hers had been. But she was glad to know that the ripples from that moment in room 247 were still spreading, still creating positive change in ways she might never fully understand. 6 months after a stuttering English teacher faced down a classroom bully, the effects were still being felt across 3 school districts in state education policy discussions, and in the life of one young man who was learning that true strength came from building others up rather than tearing them down. Rebecca Martinez had found her voice, and in doing so, she had helped countless others find theirs. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from US.